Hi everybody, and welcome to Open Democracy's weekly live discussion. I am Caroline Molloy. I am the editor of Open Democracy's UK section, and I'm really pleased that we've had a lot of registration and interest in this particular debate to see our stellar panelists. And we want to involve as many of you at home as possible. So thank you very much to those of you who submitted interesting questions in advance. And if you have questions as we're going on, we want to involve as many of you as you can. So you can submit questions in the, if you're watching on Zoom, you can submit those in the Zoom chat by clicking on the icon at the bottom of your screen. If you're watching on Facebook Live, you can do that on Facebook chat, and those should be fed through to me as we go through. So this week, we are going to be talking about how to create a radical new media organisation. And to discuss that, I am very pleased to be joined by Ash Sarkar, who is the contributing editor of Novara and familiar to many from TV screens as well, I should imagine. And also by Anthony Barnett, who is the founder of the organisation that I work for, Open Democracy, and as well as a writer and long-established journalist. And also by Sean Jacobs. Sean is the Associate Professor of International Affairs at New School, New York, and is also the founder and editor of Africa is a Country, which is an online outlet for writing on and from the African left. So I'm going to kick off because we've got lots of questions to get through. I suppose I wanted to start really by asking the obvious question, which is, why did you start, why did you start your outlet? Why did you feel it was needed? What was your kind of founding mission, if you like? And I'm going to start by coming to Sean, if that's okay, Sean.
It was like, thanks, Caroline. I was sitting here kind of hoping it would be somebody else. So if they fall over their words, then I look better. No, I mean, it's a bunch of things. I would say that it's I'm South African, and South Africa has a particularly, on the African continent, I'm not saying there weren't other radical movements within Burkina Faso, Nigeria, or Kenya, or wherever, but there's a particular experience of being from South Africa. It had one of the oldest, national liberation movement. It has had a kind of interesting relationship between sort of left-wing politics and nationalism, and so kind of I came of age in the late 1980s, and that period in particular in South Africa, it had a rich sort of opinion writing or journalism, if you want, and I was heavily influenced by that approach to journalism, kind of opinion writing. I don't know if people know the Weekly Mail, which is a South African newspaper that now exists as the Mail and Guardian, the New Nation. And also an Afrikaans newspaper there called Vrye Weekblad, which translates as Free Weekly. And I would say beyond South Africa, on the African continent itself, there's in an earlier period in the early 1960s, there was a magazine called Transition, which was established by Rajat Nyoji, who was from Uganda. He was Ugandan Indian. That magazine was a space in which the kind of new kind of post-colonial political class, anybody from like Nkrumah to Mazrui, Wally Soyinka, they would debate in that magazine. And my idea is sort of, I end up in the US after in the 2000s I was actually in grad school at Birkbeck, but I ended up in the US at the New School. And then subsequently I started working here at the University of Michigan and then at the New School. And being here, there were two things that I'll stop after this that kind of made me want to do what I did. One was to respond to the kind of images that was circulating about Africa in the West. You want to say, what was the direct thing? It's right after 9/11, with the sort of the war on terror as the main frame, and Africa was made to fit into it. And Africa was mostly I would say there were two big narratives. One was development and humanitarianism, and the other was sort of like this kind of collapsing of the continent into this sort of one kind of, Africa is literally a country. So that was, I would say, the one thing. And the second thing is, going back to what I started out with, was I felt that that the African voice in left debates was not there. And I knew for a fact that there was this very vibrant political debate happening in these countries. You know, many of the most interesting social movements of, I would say, the last decade and a half, the AIDS movement, you know, a lot of the movements demanding like sort of hardcore political rights, whether it's End SARS, Walk to Work, or what people know as the Arab Spring. These things happened on the African continent. And it's that desire to kind of have that conversation with the world on our own terms is what mostly drove what I was trying to do.
I mean, that sort of on our own terms, I think probably resonates with all of us a little bit. I'm going to come to Ash next. Ash, forgive me, I'm not actually 100% sure if you were there at the very start of Novara, or if, like myself, you joined at still a relatively early stage and had an important part to play in how it developed. So
I was lurking in the background when Novara first got started, but I wasn't directly involved. And it was really interesting listening to Sean, because it seems that you came into forming Africa as a country with quite a well-defined political purpose, and that purpose is still very much at the core of everything you're doing. Whereas I think for Novara, it changed an awful lot, and that change was also reflected in what kind of media products we were putting out. Because at first Novara was just my two colleagues, James Butler and Aaron Bastani, doing what I used to call their shouty man, sad man dialectic on the radio once a week. And the kinds of conversations that they were having were a reflection of the kinds of political interrogation that was happening in that kind of, you know, horizontalist, little bit anarchist, anti-tuition fees, anti-cuts, sort of political milieu which was going on at the time, which is sort of the years following 2010, 2011. And so lots of the kinds of conversations they were having were very, very theoretical. That's still reflected in the radio show Novara FM that we do today. But as the political moment evolved, as more people got involved in the project, I formally got involved with Novara from 2015. The kind of stuff we were doing then changed a lot. So we still, I think, see ourselves as part of a political tradition which is about movements, which is about insurgency, which is about having a very antagonistic relationship to, in particular, the British media establishment and the culture of the Westminster lobby, that kind of who's in, who's out, who's up, who's down style of political reporting. But now we start thinking about, well, how do we access as many people as possible? We still have that very deeply theoretical, very historically grounded radio show, but now we've also got a kind of current affairs offering. We've got articles, we do sort of short explainer and explorer videos, we do documentaries. And I think that now, if you were to ask any of us, well, who does Novara serve? At first, it was sort of a group of like 100 anarchists who we all knew by name, and in some cases had dated. And now we're thinking, all right, we are talking to anybody who's part of the Anglophone left who doesn't own a house, who feels locked out of the economy for whatever reason. So I think that, yeah, that change has been really profound for Novara, even if our sense of political insurgency hasn't.
Brilliant. Thank you, Ash. That's really interesting to hear. And I feel like I've been on that journey. That was certainly my first encounters. And I used to love those podcasts. I used to shout at them quite a lot as well, to be honest. So I'm going to come to Anthony now. And Anthony, so Open Democracy is celebrating its 20th birthday at the moment, which is part of the reason for running this live event. So tell us a little bit. I know you've written an article for us recently, which people can read for the detailed history. But what was your mission in starting Open Democracy? And do you recognise some of what the other panelists have said?
Yeah, definitely. So thank you. This is very, very nice. And hi to Sean and Ash. So I think we were kind of a mixture, or when Open Democracy began, we were kind of, even if you like, pre the situation that Sean found himself in that it was the millennium, the year 2000. and we felt that there should be a small group of us, 4 or 5 of us who were starting it, felt there should be an argument about what was going on. There were big changes in terms of the democracy in the UK, big changes in terms of globalization, big change, and there was both a sense of modernization. The web was very new, cyberspace was very new. You were empowered by that energy, and on the other hand, that whole atmosphere of Blairism, of closing everything down, of not having real dialogue, of our feeling suffocated, at the same time as feeling that there were new powers which we could perhaps exploit and use. And I had enough experience with fundraising, with things like Charter 88, so I could bring funders in to do something which hadn't really been tried. I mean, the Charity Commission, we tried to go, and they didn't know, what is this internet thing? Will it last? That was their attitude. And we thought that there should be a global discussion. So that was part of what we wanted to do, was to engage. We felt that these big shifts around the world, that there was a potential global readership. And what we discovered was that there was what I call as a global writership. Lots of people from around the world, especially after 9/11, wanted to write in a democratic space, but we weren't at that point part of what I think Ash has described, which is like a movement. There wasn't an organic relationship between, in fact, it was a disorganic. Most of the young generation at that point were generation neoliberal. They thought they would make money and and get on in the Labour Party, and that was the way of the future. So we started with a mix. Paul Hilder was of the younger generation, but I was of the older 68 generation. So there was a generational mix. And I think the thing that we felt, which is still, if you like, different from the brilliant work that Novara is doing, is that we're not just about trying to address those who are locked out, although we are about giving voice. We're also about addressing those who've got some economic stake. So we're from the radical democratic left, but we're not seeking just to address it. And that was the point I think Sean was making, of trying to get that voice out to the world. And I don't know whether we've succeeded, because I think this is the last thing I would say. The web siloizes people. So if you're into motorbikes, the global website for motorbike racing, there's a global website for, if you're in the left, of particular things. It's wonderful for connecting people who have already got a shared interest. But it's not so good, and it's very hard to get people that have to think about expanding their interests and think about what's going on in Turkey or Latin America, and to actually make those larger connections to address the world. And until we can do that, we won't be able to actually really take on the financial powers.
I think there's so many, what you've all covered has already sort of foreshadowed so many of the questions I wanted to ask. I'm not quite sure where to go next. I think, because we bid this as how to create a radical new media organization, and I imagine that some people are going to be watching this thinking, yeah, how do I do it? We want a how-to guide. Money was mentioned, and I'm just going to get real for a minute and say, yeah, could people say a little more about, because often it's something that we're all asked as well, I know, how the organisation got its original funding, and what's the sort of main mix of funding now? And I'm going to, well, who wants to chip in on that first? Up to you.
I mean, I can go first. Go ahead.
Sean, do you want to go, or I'll?
I mean, it's a bit unfair on Ash if you were on the margins. I think that because I think the great advantage Novara had was to start with people who wanted to have an argument with each other, even if
Anthony, I want you to talk about open democracy. I don't want you to talk about Novara.
So we had one that I had got a seed grant from Roundtrees to start a web service about what was happening to democracy in Britain for about £45,000, which is quite a lot of money. And I got that because I had run Charter 88, so I had raised lots and lots of money, and I had a reputation of being successful, whether that was deserved or not. And I was working on that, and I decided there was absolutely no point in going ahead, because it seemed to me that democracy was now a global issue, and that the British debate was tied up. It would have been a trap, and I wasn't interested in doing it. So I went back to them and said, sorry, I've got to give you your money back, because the only thing that we can work on the web would be global, would be this, would be big, and that's what I would like to do. But it's completely different. And they had a meeting with me. They called me in, and the guy, David Schutt, who's now dead, unfortunately, who was the chairman, he just said, and he leant back and he said, hey, go ahead, lad. So I was very shocked by this. And that meant that I had the funds to work with other people to plan something big. And that was a great advantage. And it came out of that experience. And then we decided to go down the route of not being party political, and therefore being open to other funders. And the main source of funding for us, because we were expensive, especially at that time, was from New York. So that I'm sure we would never have been able to fund open democracy or resource open democracy, especially at that point, from within Britain. And something like New Socialists now, which I think are very inventive and very thoughtful, and if you like, theoretical, but really serious, and they're struggling to get 500 people to support them, and they're really struggling to get that sort of funding. And whereas the situation in the US is there's much more money, and people are much more capable of saying, sure, here's some funds on which you can work with.
Sure,
so it's a very close country.
Sure, and is that your experience? Has it been easy?
Slightly different.
I didn't say easy.
How's it been, Sean, for you?
It was a little different. I mean, we started off mostly, so Africa as a country in its present form started in 2009. And that website, I would say for the first decade, was working of free labor, volunteering. Myself, I was getting a salary from the New School, but some of the people were academics, some were activists, some were, journalists. I always felt bad for people who were freelancers or who didn't have jobs or were grad students, because I couldn't pay them. So what happened, occasionally we would get, I wouldn't call it like contract money. Somebody would ask me to, let's say, do a series of essays, say during the World Cup 2014, 32 nations, 32 stories, something like that. And I would then use that money to pay people out. But in a way that would be like, okay, I can pay you something, so stick around, something's going to happen. And so, you promise people that money would eventually emerge. But I think after a while, you realize you could only keep people for, at maximum, they would stick around for a year, and you'd act like a sop front for their work. But in 2019, I received a big, massive fellowship. I mean, anybody can go Google it if they want, in hundreds of thousands of dollars that I've gotten for the last 3 years. And with that, I could start employing a staff. So I have a small staff. I have one full-time employee, a managing editor, and then I have a number of contract employees, like some copy editors, a staff writer who's based in South Africa, a video editor, and we also have a podcast producer. So, we also have got a bunch of other funding from Open Society Foundation to work on the climate activism and climate crisis. And then we've had some other funders who have approached us. But I think once we got our first batch of money, we have other funders who started approaching us. But I want to make this clear, because I think the Q&A also talked about the nature of the funding. Any funding we take, we make it very clear that we only take money where people leave us alone, where they trust us to do our work, and they don't want us to compromise our politics. I mean, we're not going to take funding if we feel this would mean that we have to dilute, our political mission or whatever we try to do. Yeah.
I should say perhaps that, I've had the same experience. I've certainly never had I've occasionally phoned people up and go, well, this story does sort of touch on the interest that's kind of related possibly to one of our funders. Is it okay? And I've always just been told, yeah. In fact, all the more reason to do it, actually. And also that we too, I've been at Open Democracy for quite a long time. And to begin with, we had raised money, but we did also, full disclosure, we did also rely sometimes to some extent on free labour, certainly of contributors. And we are, growing in our fundraising efforts and being able to pay people better. And, it's quite a different scenario now. We are also, I should perhaps at this point plug the fact that we're also very keen to grow our reader donation base, and there will be, I hope, a link appearing in the chat about how people can donate to support Open Democracy's ongoing work. But yes, Ash, I'm going to come to you because Novara's got a slightly different model, I think. Tell us about how Novara's funded.
Yeah, we do. So, I mean, like Africa as a country, we started out as entirely volunteer labour. And then, and the money that we got from donations, we put towards kit. So we need a camera, we need a multi-directional mic, and all of the labour from production to editorial was completely volunteer. Then when we started getting a bit more money, all of this up to that point is still 100% donation and subscription. And by donation, I mean donations from our readers rather than, big grant giving bodies. Then we prioritized paying our articles contributors, and it was sort of a symbolic amount. It was sort of a way of saying, we recognize your labor. We know we can't pay you as much as The Guardian does or anything like that, but our heart's in the right place. And at that point, we still weren't paying ourselves. And then we pushed a crowdfunder specifically to be able to pay staff and grow the staff team. So now everybody gets paid. I'm very glad to say we are on a flat rate of £16.50. Everyone gets paid the same no matter what they do. Freelancers get paid a bit more because of obviously the precarity involved being a freelancer. We pay all of our contributors too. At present, 92% of our funding comes from our donations and our subscriptions, and we advise people, if you want to subscribe and you don't know how much you want to give us the equivalent of an hour of your wage a month. And so it's also a way, there's a politics there to get people thinking a bit more about their own labor and the value of it and the value that they put on our labor. We don't have a paywall, everything is free. And then the other 8% comes from a mix of YouTube monetization, super chats on YouTube, and bits of grant funding, like from the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation and Emil in Melbourne. And that's usually been around specific bits of content. So Rosa Luxemburg wants us to do a documentary about Rosa Luxemburg, or Emil in Melbourne are just like, just get the Marxism out there in the world, lads, any way you can. And obviously we would do that anyway. So there's a bit of a relationship there. And I think that, if people are listening to this going, okay, but then how do I do that? How do I get a subscriber base who's invested in what I do? How do I get together people who are willing to volunteer for that amount of time before either the grant funding comes in or the subscriptions come in? The thing that I would say is that identity was so important for Novara and still is. We started out, we still are people who care about each other very much, who socialize together, who have a really strong sense of almost like subcultural identity. So we're always talking about music and films. There's an aesthetic sensibility. And that sense of identity and of, us being Novara, it meant that even when we were still like all volunteers, we would put what little money we had into throwing a massive party and just inviting everybody who was a contributor or knew us, because it felt important to sort of create some social glue that could hold the project together before the money glue came in. And that still, I think, informs a lot of how we make content, the role of participative content, particularly the super chats on YouTube, hosting live events when we're at TWT, throwing parties when it's a bit less pandemic-y. I think that sensibility still informs what we do in a very big way. And then that has sort of, seeped out, I think, into our subscribers feeling that their identity is in some way tied up in us, right? And you feed that a bit more with merch. Merch has got various catchphrases, and again speaks to that aesthetic sensibility. So I guess the thing that I would say is that when you are making radical media, and by radical I mean not just politically radical, but you're starting from a different place, which is, okay, I'm not going to have just a ton of venture capital being pumped in. Okay, I don't have an oligarch who wants me to sort of sanitize his regime. When you don't have those things, how you cultivate a sense of community and a sense of identity, I think, is really key. as to whether the project gets off the ground or not?
I mean, that leads me really nicely onto my next question. I mean, you've all talked, I really appreciate everyone's transparency about funding, and just to say that Open Democracy's funders have been posted in the chat as well, so people can have a look at that. And I think that's sort of what's our identity. You know, I don't know if Anthony would agree with this, but the conversation that I often have with my colleague Adam Ramsey about what Open Democracy is a space for is that it's a place where liberals and the left can talk to each other. You know, centrists and the left can talk to each other and have that debate as well. And that one of the things I wanted, and you talked a lot about community, you know, that sort of community cultural identity, really, Ash. And you've all mentioned that in your own way. I think, Sean, you talked about, you know, wanting to, you know, have coverage that reflected the concerns of Africans on our own terms. And Anthony, in your piece, you wrote about, you know, this idea of a community of interest and creating that. But I just wondered, you know, to what extent do you see your media outlets, all of you, as being about creating that sense of solidarity, giving people a home because their needs aren't being met by the mainstream corporate media or the legacy media? And to what extent do you see your outlet's role as challenging that audience as well? Or you know, and I'd be really interested, Sean, I see you nodding. Do you want to come in on that?
Let me, before I answer that question, let me just say something else about funding. I forgot to mention that actually the very first time we tried to say, hey, we need to think about, you know, funding our work, was we wanted to publish like a print magazine, and we went to talk to our friends at Jacobin. I mean, I wanted to like make that clear that that's kind of how that started. And then actually Jacobin were the first people to invest in a way in what we were trying to do. So they helped us redesign our website. And they actually paid a small stipend to our managing editor. He wasn't paid because we had no money. You know, we had no money. And so we were sort of working with them in the beginning. They helped us set up kind of our payment system for if people wanted to donate to us. So kind of like, that's when that's all. I think that's another key point, which I want to emphasize, is this kind of the solidarity between these different small publications, these people that are like-minded, to work together. And if I think back at the stuff I said at the beginning about the history of these kind of publications in South Africa, I was happy to see that that kind of spirit was still alive. You know, people working together, helping each other, figuring it out. Because I know people know Jacobin Tribune, which is in the US, in the UK, has a relationship with Jacobin. So kind of building on something that was already there and taking some of that techniques and, you know, moving on with it. And then the second part of this is also, I'm on the tenured faculty of the New School, and the New School provides the kind of infrastructure for us for our human resources and also for paying our freelancers. So that's helped a lot in dealing, you know, that's like a headache that I didn't have to deal with. Like how I'm setting up a payment system. You know, if we have full-time staff of the country, they get health insurance, they protect it. So those are the things that and a lot of the New School insist on, is even some of those part-time employees, like get them to a point where they also become full-time. So those are things that we invested in. On the question of you know, who's your audience? I mean, when Ash was talking earlier, and I was like, I should have brought that up, which is Africa as a country. In the same way, it started out doing something like who the original audience is not the current audience. The original audience was, we wanted to talk back. We just wanted to talk back at first to the kind of images that was circulating about Africa in the West, you know, Euro-America. But what happened was, in a way, people didn't then know that we had something else that we wanted to say. Because all we did was react, and we were reacting in this, I would say, more like a sort of, you know, liberal framework of politics. We were sort of stuck in their framework. And at some point, and I would argue that it was partly also a consequence of the technology change, because Twitter and Facebook was doing that kind of instantaneous reactions. Like if something happened and people wanted to comment on it, they did it on Facebook, they did it on Twitter. That created in our heads, almost by serendipitously, like suddenly we could do something else. And the something else was, now we could say, well, here's a way for you to think about this particular topic. Here's some ideas about, here's a usable past about the left in Africa. Here's some social movements you don't know about. And then the readership, and as my quick last point, the readership as a result then also changed. Because initially you're talking to people in the West because of the internet and the imbalances in people's access to these technologies. So you're talking to people in the West, and you're debating mostly these kind of debates that are happening in the West, and you're not debating these kind of interesting things. Fees must, this is long before fees must fall, roads must fall, etc., etc. But what happened was we began to say, no, there's interesting politics happening in these places, and there's something to be learned from them, like in Kenya, in South Africa, in Nigeria, and that's what we're trying to cover. That's what we want to bring out, and we're less concerned about what Nicholas Kristof is writing in the New York Times, or what other silly article is even sometimes written in the Guardian, where you're like, we're going to stop responding to that. We are now just writing to a different kind of audience, younger, and also like an audience that is in different places. To Anthony's point, like, and I read reading your article this morning made me think about that. It is, in a sense, a kind of global politics. It's very local, it's very national, but it's also the audience suddenly became all these people in all these different places that share these ideas and wanted a different kind of way, different kind of politics for Africa, different kind of political movements, but they were kind of stuck. They were noticing these like emergence of neoliberal authoritarianism, this kind of, this Afropolitan politics, which is sort of a version of kind of this cosmopolitanism. And they wanted to respond to it, but they didn't have an outlet. And our point was like, okay, now we can create like a path. We can begin to like, try to shape people's understanding of what's happening and maybe propose a different kind of politics.
Sure. Thank you, Sean. And Anthony, I'm gonna come to you because I was really interested to hear your views on this. Is on our intended audience, open democracy, how that's shifted, but also on whether to what extent is our role to foster that sense of solidarity that Ash was talking about quite really powerfully, and to what extent is it to challenge that audience? And I will come to you in a moment, Ash, as well.
Yeah, well, I think it's very, very interesting, and I thought Ash spoke very beautifully about the experience of how Novara grew organically, and it's quite different from, we brought a print media model to the web very early that caused incredibly difficult financial issues because it was way too expensive, and therefore that OD went, we went bankrupt more or less 2 or 3 times, and I joke in part, but I mean I did everything possible to bankrupt open democracy, and I just couldn't. It just wouldn't die, and that's partly because so many people did want to write for it without paying. They wanted to be in this space. But I think the community thing is very interesting because I think there's a crucial aspect to it, which is that we have an enemy. And I feel that that's a very important part. I don't think that open democracy is just there to have a space in which people from the left and the liberal intelligence of the center talk with each other. It was quite clear from the very beginning, although, that what was being done by globalization, the crushing of democracy that was taking place, was something we were opposed to. We didn't know how to oppose it, and we didn't really, we were conscious that we didn't understand the forces that were at work, which I think I would say without sounding arrogant, I think everybody's very much clearer about now than 20 years ago. So there was an element of exploration, but there was, and then with 9/11, we knew immediately, I mean, the moment 9/11 happened, we started a debate. We were supposed to come out fortnightly. We went daily, and we started a debate called, "Is Terror the New Cold War?" And we knew immediately what the danger was of the American response. And Paul Rogers wrote a piece very early saying, they're going to invade Iraq, and they shouldn't. And then when Iraq was invaded, he wrote a piece saying, there's going to be a 30 years war. Everybody said it would all be over in a few months, and that was it. So there was a definite sense of, and we came alive out of opposing the way in which the world was being run by the neoliberal elite. And I think that's any community, if you say people should be talking with each other and coming from different traditions, which we are certainly open democracy is about, they need to be able to share certain issues and fundamental problems, and the world is becoming at the moment less democratic with the rise of Trumpism or Johnson in this country, Or with Xi in China and Modi, and and what's going on in Zimbabwe, and so those issues of having that, how do we fight that fight, is part of what keeps the readership going, and which makes us radical.
I think so. I remember the first time I ever came across Open Democracy before I worked here was reading an article about Richard Branson's Virgin Company's involvement in the privatisation of the NHS, and I just read it and thought, I would not read this in the Guardian. Right. So yeah. So Ash, just
add one thing. I do think there's a shift. I say this, which has happened, which I write about, which is now characterising democracy, which is that of towards investigation, and the element of taking on authorities which are being undemocratic and learning how to do that, which is very difficult, and doing it well, and even taking them to the courts or to Parliament. And that element is now, I think, part of the cutting edge, defining what open democracy is doing. And that's a very big change from how we began, and one I welcome.
Sure, no, absolutely. Thank you, Anthony. And I mean, Ash, I just was kind of come to you. I guess it would be fair to say that, well, open democracy gets plenty of stick. Novara certainly gets plenty of stick, sometimes for sort of, just giving people what they want and being in its own bubble, I suppose, kind of stuff I see on Twitter. So yeah, what's your take on that? Do you think that that's actually, you make no apologies for that's really important to do? Or do you think that there's also, well, for sort of challenging the readers? Do you get sort of pushback from your readers on stuff you publish as well?
I mean, I just wanted to sort of co-sign what Anthony said, which is I see Open Democracy is primarily an investigative platform. So when I need to see some investigative work, which I can't see in The Guardian, I go to Open Democracy. That's how I utilize you guys as a resource. And I don't see you as a polemical platform so much. I don't come to you for comment, I come for you for numbers. When it comes to Novara's relationship with our audience, I think we've got like a few things going for us, which mean that the sort of Corbynite hive mind, which I know that the people at the Observer and the Times would like to sort of box us in as, it's not quite true. One is that because we've been doing this.
You mean you're not getting those WhatsApps telling you what to say all the time?
You know what? Like
we are too.
The earpiece that Seamus Milne fit me with is on the blink. I've not heard from him for ages. One is that we've been doing this for 10 years. So with all of us, you can see how our thinking has changed, because if you take somebody, my own experience here is that I'm first involved with, Novara when I'm 23 and, I'm nearly 30 now. You do a lot of changing in that time. You go from thinking really rigidly, where you go, I've read the Wikipedia on Judith Butler, I think I know how the world works, mister, to suddenly, you read more, you're aware of all the things you don't know, and your thinking develops naturally. So there's a kind of internal dissensus with like the character development of all of us. The second thing is the dynamics between us as staff, contributing editors, and also everyone else who works there too in production roles, which is whether on camera or off camera, we are always arguing with each other, right? That's part of the fun, right? We have whole Slack channels just dedicated to pushing and prodding at people's ideas, often taking, the piss out of each other, right? And that dissensus, I think, is then mimicked, particularly on the live streams that we do and the social dynamics which we display, which then I think gives permission for the audience to feel challenged because they also see their champion being embodied in that debate at the same time. So it gives us room to push a bit. And then the third thing, and I think that you have hit on something, which is when you have what we call a 1,000 true fans model, which is you're going to survive as an organization if you have at least 1,000 true fans. That what happens when you challenge people in a way where they feel a sense of betrayal. Now, that is something which is happening more and more because our audience is that much bigger. And so when everyone comes into it going, you're here to serve me, you're here to reflect my political beliefs, my values, my interests, inevitably, as you grow as an organization, not just in terms of the staff team, but when we bring more and more contributors in, there are going to be people who feel you're not speaking for me right now. And you just have to go, that's part of us growing. that's part of us growing. And we have the ambition to be as big one day as, you know, one of the Murdoch owned big boys. All right. We want that size of audience. And that means that you've got to have the same expectations that you would of an outlet of that size, where, you know, if someone publishes an article that you don't like, you don't then feel personally betrayed by Aaron Bastani or whatever it is. I think that that's not to say that the audience shouldn't hold us to high standards, because we strongly believe in that as well. Like, pull us up on stuff if there are factual inaccuracies, pull us up when we've gotten something wrong. But if the only problem is a political difference, you go, that's growth.
I think you've maybe been you reminded me very much of my morning Signal chats. We moved off WhatsApp to Signal to be like arguing with each other all the time. And I would say, Ash, it's nice to meet you in person. I don't think we've met before, and I sometimes feel that commenting on UK politics and analysing UK politics can be quite a male game, and it's nice to encounter you. I'm
all lad, baby. I'm all lad.
Well, maybe I'm going to sort of shift the conversation on, because I've got a few more things I really want to get through, and I suppose, you know, I just want to know from everybody, when did you first really think, oh my God, my outlet is making such a difference? And I'm going to come to you, Anthony, I think first. Like, when did you really think, wow, Open Democracy's impact is what I had hoped for?
Well, I think it came alive with 9/11. So and it changed completely. We were going to be a subscription. There was going to, you know, sort of base, and it was going to be slow, and that it became a website at that moment. There was something going on around the world, and there were contributions coming in from Turkey and from India and from New York, and there was that was the moment when I thought, yeah, this is different, and it started to become something which I wasn't, you know, nobody really knew before, which started to become a website. And I didn't read websites at that point. So yeah, and that was the point where it became something, it took on a life, and it became different. It changed me rather than it being something that I, with others, were trying to bring into existence. We sort of discovered it at that moment.
And as you said, you mentioned that Paul Rogers article, which is
sorry?
You mentioned that Paul Rogers article, which is kind of, you know, deep in the founding legend, I think, of Open Democracy, that it was, you know, so prescient about what was coming at a time when others were not really talking about it.
Yeah, but he wasn't alone in the discussions we were having. I supported it, and I encouraged it, and I headlined it, but we were all, I think there was a group of us that could see what was going on. A lot of people were against especially the Iraq invasion. That was very big, and I think one of this is another discussion, but one of the tragedies of Corbynism is it was rooted in the anti-war movement, but it never led the anti-war movement into it could have become a much bigger, not a sectarian, not a lefty thing.
Well, we're going to have a discussion on the tragedies of Corbynism another time, Anthony.
Okay.
I think. But yeah. But sorry, did you want to finish that point? I didn't mean to.
No, you cut me off. It's fine. I'm very happy about that.
I mean, I'm just really conscious of time, and I mean, one of the things, before I come on to our other guests with that question, one of the things that really about making a difference. One of the things that's really coming through from all you're saying is that sort of international perspective. I mean, you in your article, Anthony, wrote, I thought, made the really interesting point that certainly when Open Democracy was set up, and perhaps I'd be interested in people's thoughts on this still to some extent now, there's not so, I mean, we talked about international funding being very useful, but in terms of that international audience, you know, you said, Anthony, that there was a kind of financial international readership that absolutely know that they need to go know what's happening in Saudi and Russia and God knows where else. But, you know, perhaps I'm going to sort of slightly tweak the question just for the sake of time and come to you, Sean, and absolutely ask, when did you first feel like you were making a difference? But also, you know, how you see that international audience playing out. I mean, you're in the country that's carved up by colonialism, and you know, you're writing about the continent carved up by colonialism. And we are speaking, most of us here, from the country that did that carving, which Anthony has also written a lot about, the kind of the tensions in the nation state. And Ash, I remember you doing brilliant Brexit coverage, going and reporting on the sort of regional and national tensions and the cultural identity questions around that, you know. So there's all these kind of, I'm trying to roll a few questions into one, and I'm doing it very inexpertly, so please forgive me. But I'd like to know about when you felt you're making a difference, but maybe bringing in some of these kind of international tensions that have been sort of present in this discussion a little more, and the role of the nation state and that nation state related media as well. So Sean, over to you.
I mean, I'll be short this time because I think I take up a lot of air. So one, I would say, in terms of kind of my longer answer, which I'm not going to do, is I actually don't think that we have done like the full potential of what we're trying to do. So I'm not sure whether we, you know, like we've arrived. I don't think we feel, because that tension of not feeling you've not arrived is kind of then what drives you, right? But on the other hand, it is true that in the first iteration of Africa's country, the one that was concerned about media images, there was a point when, you know, journalists, etc., people would, and also the media started writing about us, or they would like describe us, they would do a news story and describe Africa as a country in a couple of lines, you know, as like the descriptions of African country is usually this little website that is changing the way that journalists approach or write about Africa, or that is bringing you this kind of different left perspective on Africa. So that was when you're like, okay, you know, people take seriously what we write. I think the other one is to something Ash said earlier, and maybe I'm not sure if I misheard that, but it's that point also where people are invested in it as they feel this thing represents them, speaks for them. And when they discover that it is, well, it's two things. One, it is this house with many rooms for the left. Like there's many rooms that kind of could be represented in this house and not just your tendency, then they're upset, or they get upset if they feel, and we've had an example of that, I think, in the last 2 weeks. Sorry, that's the New York traffic going nuts again. But we had an example where we did this incisive book review about books about the new South Africa by one of his sort of young leading intellectuals. And our review was quite critical of his argument, and it was in that corner of Twitter and the internet, it was trending, you know, for like a day or so, and there were people who were really upset with that. But for me, that was more confirmation of they talking about this. They cannot avoid us like that. If you're in this, for me, the way my brain works, I'm the happiest when people are talking about us. If they're not about us, that's about the thing we wrote about, or the explainer we made, or the podcast we did. If they're not doing that, then it means we didn't do our job. So, like I said, it's like on the one hand, I'm happy if we've achieved some stuff, but I really love that feeling of like people saying, "Oh, Africa's a country said this," or "Did you see what Africa's country wrote about that?" That makes me come alive.
Thank you. And I think you widely quoted. I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? I suppose if I want to know about what's happening in Africa, I've in the past felt like I've needed to rely on, you know, the BBC World Service or something like that. But in the internet era, that's so different now. And I you know, you're obviously cited on those outlets as well a lot. Ash, I'm going to come to you and ask, you know, when did you feel, if you could be fairly brief because we are getting close to time, but when did you feel like your outlet was making the biggest difference? Or when did you first feel that?
I think the beauty of Novara and how close we are with our audience is that I felt that immediately. I just felt like I was in something. I felt I was part of a conversation, and I felt that we were valuable to a movement which only got bigger in the years that followed. And so I think that we were very lucky because of, you know, we had like first mover advantage within the UK. No one had tried to do what we had done yet. The Corbyn movement happens, everything blows up, and so it's able to feel like, you know, you're an instrument of history, and it feels like really great. But I would say that maybe the time where I felt that what we do has been most meaningful was actually well after Corbyn, and it's when the first lockdown came in and Michael Walker and our live stream producer Fox made the decision to take Tisky Sour from once a week to every night, and then now we do it 3 times a week with a view to going every day soon. And people were coming up to me on the street saying, I can't trust what the BBC are saying about coronavirus. Like, Robert Peston's an idiot. He's a bibbling idiot. He'll say whatever the government wants him to say. But Michael Walker, I trust. And it's because Michael, I think, has got this very rigorous, incisive mind, and he's an unorthodox thinker. Michael will never think something just because you tell him it's the right thing to think. He will chew through the data and chew your arm off until he reaches his own conclusion. And that's why he made Tisky Sour such a powerful platform for helping people make sense of this, once in a century experience that we were suddenly all having, that we had no blueprint for, and also for holding the government to account. So I really I'm gonna
have to cut you off, Ash, because we are running very close to time, and I wanted to get 2 last things in. Firstly, I felt like I had been a little unfair to Anthony and sprung on him this question about the when you felt it was making a difference. But actually, I was particularly interested, Anthony, you obviously with your background around constitutional reform, one of the things that I notice on Open Democracy is that if I ever get wrong that something affects Scotland, just this sort of issue of the national tensions, then I get quite rightly landed on by a lot of people pointing out not only that no, the situation in Scotland is very different and the media serves Scotland and other certain nations are very subsidiary, very poorly, but they also tell me that they expect far better of Open Democracy. They expect it from other media outlets, but we are not allowed to treat the other nations as if they were all just England. And I wonder, that was kind of a deliberate strategy of yours, I think, early on, given your background, wasn't it?
Well, Open partly came out of the unresolved democratic crisis, which New Labour created with the Scottish and Welsh parliaments and assemblies and the Human Rights Act and freedom of information. Those are the things which I had fought for from the 1980s, and then refused. What happened was that Blair broke the old constitution and used that to give himself effectively dictatorial power. And so there was a big argument, which I was having with sort of hand-to-hand lobbying, that this was mad and would end in disaster, and in Boris Johnson in a way and Brexit is a personification of that. So the whole issue wasn't just Scotland, but the fact that you've got a constitutional framework which is broken and which is taking us on in a terrible direction. And absolutely at the center of that is the English question. It's not the Scottish question. It's how do you speak for England as a democrat? How do you speak England as a democratic country historically? And yet, those who are for Europe and who are English, are international, they're for Brexit. They don't like the national question. And the national question is at the heart of the democratic question and the heart of the constitutional question. And I think I'm very proud of the fact that we're there, and that it is constantly coming back. Brexit is if you like, a kind of a broken expression of it. And it's going to remain until England becomes a proper European country and can rejoin the European Union. And therefore, that should be part of any democratic culture.
Thank you, Anthony. I suppose just sort of in conclusion, really, one concluding question I was going to ask, we've all got the sense of the challenges ahead and the opportunities ahead. And I think people listening to this will have been excited by, what it sounds like to have set up a radical news organisation and to have been successful. One last question I wanted to ask was, do we actually need, if someone's listening to this thinking, I'm going to do it, do we actually need more radical news organisations? I don't want to take that as read. What do you think? Do we need more radical news organisations? And if so, what's the one gap that's maybe not what your organisation's doing that you'd really like to see someone else doing? Sean, I'm going to come to you just in a few sentences, if you may.
My short answer is yes. May 1,000 flowers. What's that thing? Bloom.
Bloom.
That's it. I can't think of what there's a gap, but I would say we need more of whatever.
Brilliant. And Ash, what about you?
No, you should all come to work for Novara so we can bloat like the New York Times and just eat up all the other journalists who would ordinarily work for other people. No, of course we need more left-wing, progressive, radical media, however you want to frame that. And the beauty is that social media has opened up space to make that happen, to monetize it, without you needing permission from gatekeepers. So you can come to people like Anthony or me and Sean and go, well, how did you do it? But if you find a space that the three of us haven't been able to identify and you want to go for and exploit it, the beauty of, you know, the accessibility of these platforms is that you can. And more than that, you should, if you can see something no one else can see.
Anthony, I know you wrote about how you tried, I think, 3 times to set up radical sort of left-leaning news organisations. 2 failures and 1 success. Do we need more?
No, more is good. Yeah, of course, because the point is, you know, Ash made the point about we want to sort of displace the Murdoch media, and the right-wing media is a plurality. That's one of its strengths. I mean, you know, there is the Washington Post, there is the LA Times, there was Time magazine. It's not just the New York Times in America, and the same thing here. And that sense of there being a choice and of different views and of having a pluralism, the one thing we don't want is 1 or 2 very large bloated organizations which you then can't escape from. So the danger, the difficulty is that the web has this, it's a 2-edged sword. It's got this enormous advantage, which Ash has just talked about, which is it's completely lowered the cost, the startup cost. You can start a world website, one person can start, but it also, and can be read around the world, but it also tends to dissolve the sense of people working together and to separate and to siloize. And the work of bringing, and the moment people start to come together, there's an enormous amount of money is going to be spent by the right to split, to divide, to use, you know, to encourage, even by planting people in sort of destructive language. So having a language of solidarity and of bringing people together while everybody being able to find themselves and find their own voice, that is not, you know, it's easy to say. It's really hard to do, but the more people can do it, the better.
So thank you, Anthony, and thank you, everyone. There you go. Fill your boots. If you've got an idea that we haven't thought of, go ahead and do it. But stay in touch with us. Let us know what we're doing. We can all be nice in solidarity together. And I think this debate has really reflected that. So I'd really thank the panelists for taking part. We have a debate like this, a weekly debate on an issue of the day every week. So the sign up link should go in there. I noticed someone else has put a link to their YouTube channel, our Trade Union TV. Why not? These are exactly the kinds of initiatives that it's nice to see going on. But yeah, we should have the link to sign up to our website and to sign up for the debates next week. We, as I said earlier, we do rely on contributions large and small, and the model of relying on smaller donations from those who can afford to give maybe just a little and regularly is actually a really strong one. So we would encourage you to consider doing that to Open Democracy, and we have also posted links to Sean and to Ash's sites in the chat as well, so people can donate to those too if they feel so inclined. So I think that's all from me. I'm just 2 minutes over time. My apologies to the panel and to all of you. Thanks for being with us today, and thanks very much. I hope to see you all next week. Bye.
Bye-bye. Bye.